So I've opened with this in the polling, and I was going to say that I'm sure more than a few of you said no when you read the title, and I can see actually in the polling that's coming back that the large majority of you are indeed saying no. But you're here anyway, so I'm going to carry on. So a lot of people decide that they're going to do it because of this, and if this is what you imagine, I'm afraid there's a little bit more to it. I was just saying to Joel that I actively work towards becoming a CISO from the kind of the middle of my consulting career, probably about 6 or 7 years ago, thinking that it would be quite a long journey, not really imagining how long it would take or when I'd get there. I did CISO advisory for about 6 years and other consulting quite a long time before that, working closely alongside a CISO, and realized it was something that I was ready for. I spoke to my boss, just happened to be speaking to him at a barbecue, and asked him if he thought I could ever be one. And he said, well, you're better than 99% of CISOs that I know already, so go for it. Implying that he was the 1%, I think. But and it kind of turned out that all I really needed was someone to give me that permission, because 2 months later I was starting my first CISO role. However, 5 years down the road from that, I feel like I may have actually done my last now. It's worth, oh, sorry, going backwards and forwards. It's worth, and again, we had a chat about this just before we joined about, and don't worry, it's not all cartoons all the way through, but asking what is a CISO, and I said to Joel at the beginning, it's basically the most senior person in an organization is quite often or usually described as a CISO these days, but that is often just a security manager. There's a lot of CISO roles advertised which aren't really CISO level, and that can often be reflected in salary. But if you are new to the role and want experience, those tend to be your way in. So, you know, if you haven't got to that level, go and get those ones, because next time round you'll get into the ones which actually are at that level. You need to be aware really that a CISO with a C-level remit needs to be more of a strategist, and setting that strategy doesn't really mix so well with the detailed technical management. And they're two different roles, and if you try and do them both, which I have to say I have done, it creates very fast burnout. I wanted to make the point that they're different because I know I'm very aware that I'm being followed by a very good technician, and I don't want any of the comments I make, between strategy and tactics or technical ability to be taken as negative. You need both roles. You need both skill sets for good security. Like on a battlefield, you need people who can get stuck in and do the fighting, and people who know how to fight and where to put people on the field. I mean, 25 years ago, I was working at terminals, typing in Unix commands, and the only reason that I know what I know is because I've come from a technical background. So it probably took me about sort of 20 years of aiming generally in a direction before I became a CISO. And the 4 roles I've got on the screen there, I've been 3 of those. I had about 7 years in engineering, 4 or 5 in analysis, and then I moved into management and waited until the right role came up. And the real key here, if you're going for a CISO role, is visibility. You can do it much more quickly by moving into that management layer sooner, raise your profile earlier. But like a typical engineer, I wanted to make sure I knew my subject before I moved on. I never actually did the auditing, and I'm sorry if anyone is, but they were always the people in the room who I felt like they were there to catch me out, not to help. These days, I actually see how useful they are, but at those days, I wasn't so much. And the last sort of 12, 13 years, I've been very firmly here. I still do it now. It's much higher level. It's more advisory these days, consultancy, but it's still my favorite role by far. And again, as I said just before we came on, it's probably because I like talking. It was a key to finding my way into the CISO role because it gave me visibility. It gave me visibility with recruiters, credibility with management. As an engineer, you always think security is about technology. As an analyst, you always think it's about risk. And then as a consultant, you think you need to know everything. And something you'd learn quite early on is if you know one set of controls, or even two or three, you can do consultancy. I was going to ask a question about which control sets you use and most frequently. But the one that comes up over and over again is ISO 27001. I think everybody in security uses it. There's also standards like PCI DSS. You have really in-depth, complicated control sets like NIST 800-53. But the lowest common denominator across all of them is the controls. I got very deeply into 27001 as a class consultant because I had to, not through choice, I have to say. I was also a PCI QSA at one point for Symantec a long time ago, and then I got into the NIST side at Vodafone. I then became a business unit CISO, probably more of what you would call a BISO these days. The business unit was actually 6,000 people, so it was still relatively big. And I hired a head of risk because head of risk, because that was seen as my area of expertise because I'd done the class consultancy. We ended up having quite a lot of navel gazing conversations that kind of went like this. We would say, well, we're not reporting risk accurately. How can we make it more accurate? I was like, well, that doesn't matter because we never report it at the right level. It's like, well, the controls then are going to be pointless because this risk management's really subjective. And so, okay, but think of risk management more of an art form than a science. And at that point, we say, well, it doesn't feel like it's worth doing. Should we just give it up? To which I would always reply, look, if you have the governance right, then all of that, it will be irrelevant. But what does that mean? I was going to again have another question here saying, when I say governance, what do you hear? And I'll explain the picture before I go on. When I left that role, I was given a chocolate cake about 1 foot wide and 1.5 foot long that had governance in 8-inch high letters across the middle because I was talking about it so much. And those problems that I had with risk and controls had led to a bit of an obsession with governance. So much so that I'm now seen as the go-to guy in my peer group, which I slightly resent, as I still consider myself a hands-on techie. I'm a consultant, and I was a CISO. But governance for me is the key for being a CISO, because it's usually taken for granted when it's there and ignored if it's not. But then when it's lacking, everybody gets in a mess and they blame each other. But it gets a bad rap because it's entirely misunderstood. And what I was expecting to come out of that poll was that people, when they hear governance, they hear policy and standards. What it means to me is more around ownership. It was around that time that I first heard about the cybersecurity framework. I actually looked at it to use as a control set, quickly realizing that it wasn't one, but actually more of a governance framework. I'm not going to spend any time going into CSF because you have to come and see another talk of mine if you want to see that. But I spent a short time delivering a target operating model around CSF at that time. I did it as a CISO advisor, and it was insanely successful. It was 5 months piece of work, and we managed to transform an entire department of an insurance company and turned it around so that the FCA were actually mentioning how good it was, which was amazing for me. And it was that later that summer that I went to that barbecue, and they said, yeah, my boss said, yes, you go and be one. So then I joined Smart DCC as the CISO there, thinking it would be a walk in the park. And that's where that real challenge hit me. What I realized about governance was it's key to driving down risk and improving controls, policies and standards are just when you write it down, it's reflecting the governance. But the things that you see on the screen there, they're all theoretical delivery. The key to good governance is actually that ownership, but it's nothing without the understanding and acceptance of the business. And that means your exco and your board, and they are not your normal peer group or your usual peer group that you're used to in security management. Getting people to own things is hard. People don't like being given responsibility, and they hate being given it by other departments. Security is across the business, and you'll hear people talking about alignment with the business all over the place. What that really means is actually having the authority and the power to give that ownership to the business and them to accept it. Getting uniform information from your controls is hard. So if whatever you observe becomes the focus, more so if you show your executive peers. So if you're measuring a metric and then you want to show that to somebody who's on your exco, they will remember that and they will come back to it. So if you're showing them very detailed, very, very narrow focus controls, you will always be measured on that very narrow area, which creates the wrong sort of focus. So if you want to understand all of the costs and the controls across your organization, that gets really hard. And so, the understanding what needs to change, what improvements to create, then comes solely down to experience if you don't have any other way of looking at that. And this is typically where people bring in consultancies, but that also becomes very costly. So this is where the barrier to being a CISO in that strategic environment is quite high. If you then go to kind of delegation, and delegation's easier, but getting people to do exactly what you want, that's really hard, and it requires the management experience. And then the last thing is around reporting. Reporting should be easy, but if you have to do it all on your own, or tell a consultant what you want them to do and actually reflect what you're trying to do, that's really hard. So the best way to do it is to obviously get the support of your executive management, and that means having the time to speak to them and the experience of doing so as a peer. If you start having conversations outside of the security department now, and I don't mean just in the IT world, and I mean, across the business, then that's a good way of getting a foot in the door, making sure you can understand what the business needs and how you can help them. And I'm starting to see this a lot more when I'm doing consultancy. People spend a lot more time actually being consultative themselves as part of the security department, talking across the business, and it's a good way of getting that experience. So if you just take a minute with all of that to consider what it's like to be a CISO, you might think I'm ignoring technology, and I'm not at all. I rely on my technical background pretty much on a daily basis. People know that they can't pull the wool over my eyes, but what I don't want to do is focus in on that technology when I'm talking upwards, because then everything becomes delivery focused, stressful, it becomes urgent. So I leave that to project managers. Otherwise you end up like Wile E. Coyote here, buried by your own project. If you're focusing on the technology as a CISO, you will always fall foul of being measured by that. So executive management, it's not about reporting on firewall rules or SOC metrics or technical KPIs. It's not even discussing risks with the CIO these days. It's much more of that cross-business problem. And you'll have heard that in pretty much any talk with a CISO in the last year, probably. And for me, it was about the overall maturity of my department, that insight into the data that I had available, creating continuous improvement, showing the investment, and the maturity was that return on it. And all of that is what contributes to the CISO stress. And again, my last question here was going to be, what was the biggest pressure for a CISO? And I was going to lead into this from it. So I wanted to know about my maturity and show my return on investment. I wanted to know what it meant so that I could get money to improve it and to show my peers. All of that requires quite a bit of upfront work, or my own efforts, and I couldn't guarantee the quality if I got a consultant in or if I did it myself. And all of that started to build up, and it became incredibly pressured. So the problem, and there's a very common pattern among CISOs where they have, there's a pretty much universal 17 to 18 month lifespan of a CISO in a business now. You'll find people that have been in their job for 12 years. You'll find people that hop around every few months, but the average is a 17 to 18 month lifespan. And that's because the first 3 or 4 months is your settling in period. Most will create a 90 to 100 day plan after the first couple of weeks. Then those findings and plans are presented to an exec and often the board if they need a large investment. And then the clock starts ticking. And then from that point, improvements have to be shown for that investment. So the CISOs usually report on risk, but then the threat continues to increase as well. So 6 months later, if that threat's gone up, that risk could have increased, not reduced. So then the board are looking at, well, we've spent millions of pounds to reduce a risk. We talked about nearly a year ago, and now we're being told that it's worse. This is not the right person for this job. And then the pressure starts and that increases. And the board will either remove or replace, or the CISO will leave because they're, a lot of them are very skilled at applying that pressure. So you get risk leads to the strategies being sort of built on shifting sands and then incorrect budgeting. And the areas are compounded as well. Teams burn out as well because they're chasing that curve, and it creates a poor culture. So focusing on the wrong part of the problem still buries the CISO, much like this again. So I addressed this by reporting on maturity instead of risk, which was a really simple fix, but it was, again, still had the same effect of actually I was still had to collect all of that data and show it somehow, and it became very pressured. And to get around it, I actually ended up using a consultancy, so I was still getting the same data, but that data is out of date as soon as it's complete. It's still not particularly satisfactory, because as a CISO, you want to be talking about where you are now, not where you were 3 months ago. And of course, a consultancy can be very expensive. I think I spent in a region of about 80 grand to get one environment, and we had 6. So that was, if I'd done it for every environment, I would have been blowing my budget before I even started. So the best way that I can describe it is the CISO is being stretched between 2 very high pressure roles. So the security management on the left, where I've got the cybersecurity framework in that circle on the left. And then the executive in the corporate governance side, they're responsible for, direction for the underlying security strategy that underpins the business. And done correctly, both of those are full-time roles. So it all sounds pretty bleak, and I could leave the talk here and leave you with the problems. But first off, I love being a CISO. I love the control, the pace, the seniority, the kudos, and the money. Yeah. Secondly, I don't like just sitting around and accepting that problems can't be fixed. And because I spent so long getting there, I'd analysed and reanalyzed. I'd done the controls, the risk, the governance, the schmoozing with execs, the politics side. And I started asking my CISO friends, when we went into lockdown, I had a WhatsApp group with 50 odd CISOs on it. And I consider them all friends now. We still talk regularly. So I just started asking them, actually, whilst I was still a CISO, I was asking them, what do you guys use to get around this problem, describing what I just spent the last half an hour describing. And the resounding answer came back as, there is nothing. We don't have anything that does that. So I started looking at ways that I could fix it. Now, the last reason that I want to talk to you is because I get to pitch to you about what I've been doing for, well, the whole of lockdown, essentially. And it's about how we elevate the CISO. So I started a new company back in January last year called Procorder. So now I'm a CEO. I don't have to be a CISO anymore. I've only CEO to 5 people. So I'm not particularly chief or particularly executive, but we mapped out the solution. We hired a developer. We spent the first 3 months just collecting requirements, talking to my CISO peers. We hired the developer a week before we went into lockdown, and I thought, oh no, it's a disaster. But I still had those 50 captive CISOs on the end of a phone. And some of them even had some consultancy work for me, which was quite nice. So my developer spent the first few months, so in July, he got to an MVP position. We then went and got some funding. So in September, we had funding for up until the end of March this year. And when we released the MVP, we got commitments for doing proof of concepts, and we got a very interesting looking roadmap. Now we've actually finished the first 2 sprints, and it's really coming on nicely. So we're automating that collection of maturity data, basically completing the kind of the maturity audits that used to take several months. They can happen over the course of a couple of days or weeks. And we're now building out the functionality to map all of that data to the business models in real time. And I have to say, it's probably the most fun that I've had since I was doing architecture, because it feels very much the same thing. I'm building something. So now, this is a bit marketing, I'm afraid, but we've joined those 2 loops. We've elevated the CISO position, so he's part of that executive conversation, but he's getting all of the data out of that security organization. So that disconnect they feel from managing a team and working with an exec board is turned into a continuous loop where you've got the feedback in both directions. It means that you can have a lot better strategic decisions. It sets organizations on the path of continual improvement, and it reports on risk and maturity, gives that return on investment. And the best thing for me is we're seeing the tool work. And it's funny, when I showed this to my first investor, she said, well, if you can make this work, why would you need a CISO? And then I saw her eyes light up and she went, oh yeah, okay. And the investment came. Of course, I don't want to replace CISOs. I didn't do this to replace CISOs. I did it to support them, because I know that this is 2 different jobs, and you need to be able to take the strain of that away from the CISO and let them focus on important things and actually spend a bit more time talking to people. And as we say on our website, we're setting the CISO free, which is hopefully a bit less bleak.